Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum students. Today I will be very briefly discussing with you people apoptosis. Apoptosis. Students, apoptosis is defined as programmed cell death. Programmed cell death. Students, why we call it programmed cell death? This is because cell decides itself to die off. Why the cell decides to die off? Because in most of the cases there is no need of that cell. Students, the main difference between necrosis and apoptosis is that both are types of cell death, but the difference is in necrosis the cell dies because of some external factors, which might be trauma, which might be any destroying antigen. Whereas on the other hand, apoptosis is programmed cell death. The cell decides itself to die off. Students, there are two types of apoptosis: physiological apoptosis and pathological apoptosis. Physiological apoptosis and pathological apoptosis. Students, physiological apoptosis is under normal physiological conditions. We take the example of tadpole. Tadpole is immature form of adult frog. Tadpole has a tail, whereas frog doesn't have a tail. So, during physiological apoptosis, there are structural changes in the tadpole which converts the tadpole into adult frog. There is disappearance of the tail, the most important and main convincing feature. Okay? Similar second clinical example is destruction of RBCs. Students, you all know that life of a red blood cell is 120 days. When 120 days are completed, red blood cells, they die off automatically in the spleen. Okay? These are the two examples of physiological apoptosis. Now, pathological apoptosis. Pathological apoptosis means the cell decides to die off as a result of some abnormal pathology. We can quote an example of MI, myocardial infarction. Okay, students? Which we call heart attack in simple words. In MI, under the effect of ischemia, some of the cells, they undergo necrosis, and some of the cells, they undergo pathological apoptosis. Why they decide to go for death? Because of ischemia. Okay, students? Another example I remember in physiological apoptosis is T cell apoptosis. Students, T lymphocytes are being continuously produced in our body in the bone marrow. And these T lymphocytes, they undergo normal physiological apoptosis in the thymus gland. And this normal physiological apoptosis of T cells, it continues in our life. Okay? These were the examples of apoptosis. Now students, we discuss the mechanism of apoptosis. Mechanism of apoptosis. Students, there are two mechanisms involved in apoptosis. Number one, extrinsic. Extrinsic pathway or extrinsic factors. Number two, intrinsic pathway. Intrinsic pathway. Okay, these are the two mechanisms which are involved in apoptosis. We discuss extrinsic pathway first. Students, in extrinsic pathways, two extrinsic factors are most important. Number one, students, number one is withdrawal of survival signals. Students, our cells of the body, they continue to reproduce, they continue to develop, they continue to replicate under the effect of survival signals in the body. And these signals are produced from their adjacent cells. So, when there is withdrawal of survival signals, the cell undergoes apoptosis. Okay? Second mechanism which is responsible for extrinsic pathway is phase ligand. Phase ligand. Students, these proteins, phase ligand proteins, they are responsible for apoptosis. How they are responsible for apoptosis? Because phase ligand proteins, they activate death receptors. They activate death receptors on the surface of cells, and as a result, death cascade is activated, which causes apoptosis. Okay, I once again summarize the extrinsic pathway of apoptosis. Two mechanisms are involved in extrinsic pathway. Number one, withdrawal of survival signals. When these signals are withdrawn, the cells automatically die off. Number second, phase ligand proteins. These proteins, they activate death receptors on the surface of cells, which ultimately causes apoptosis of the cells. Okay, students? Now we discuss Intrinsic pathway. Students, intrinsic pathway. In intrinsic pathway, two factors are involved. Number one, P53 genes. P53 genes. Students, these P53 genes, they are produced in our body under the influence of any DNA damage. When there is any damage or change in the DNA, there is production of P53 genes. And when these P53 genes, they are accumulated in large amounts inside the cell, they cause apoptosis. Okay? Second intrinsic factor is caspases enzymes. Caspases enzymes. Students, these are proteolytic enzymes which are responsible for destruction of cellular proteins. Whenever there is increased production of caspases enzymes inside the cells, the cell undergoes apoptosis. Okay, I summarize the intrinsic pathway. Two factors are responsible for intrinsic mechanism of apoptosis. Number one, P53 genes. And number two, caspases enzymes, which are proteolytic enzymes. Okay, students, I hope it will be very clear for all of you. Thank you and Allah Hafiz.